describe the experience of a small family of Russian immigrants who arrive in the city of Boston and with great, great hopes for their future. Masha Gessen, just tell us a little bit about where the Tsarnaev family originated from and why their story inside Russia is so important to what happened, what culminated in the Boston massacre.
Right. So long before they came to Boston, they had spent their entire lives zigzagging around the former Soviet Union, trying to find a place where they could belong. They essentially originated in exile, and that's very much the Chechen story. It's a story of dislocation.
So they were Muslim Chechens, and the Chechens got into trouble because of the Second World War, essentially.
I wouldn't say they got into trouble. I would say they were singled out by Stalin, like many other ethnicities, quite unfairly, as any crime committed against an entire group of people is by definition unfair. Anyway, he decided that they had betrayed the Soviet Union. And so, like several other ethnic groups from the North Caucasus, they were rounded up in 1944 and shipped all the way across the Soviet Union to Central Asia, to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. So the Tsarnaev family ended up in Kyrgyzstan in exile. And there was the next dozen years, which began with them basically living out in the open with starvation rations that were below the starvation rations in Auschwitz. And they didn't even always get them.
And most of the Chechens simply died. I mean,
most of them died.
And this was because they had been invaded by the German army and they were therefore regarded as traitors by Stalin.
Chechnya wasn't even mostly occupied. It's, there's no explanation for this heinous crime. They were deported. And it's a miracle that any of them survived at all, but they did, and they persisted. And because for 12 years they were deprived of all the rights of citizenship accorded Soviet citizens, they formed a sort of unofficial parallel economy in the Soviet Union, which is at the root of what we now talk about as the Chechen Mafia. But you have to understand that these are networks that were formed because they were completely forced out of society. And in the late 1950s, they were allowed to return to Chechnya, but not to reclaim their land and not to reclaim their homes. So many people stayed in Central Asia, and the Tsarnaev family was one of those who stayed in Central Asia, dreaming of returning to Chechnya at some point. And then when the parents of the Tsarnaev brothers married in the late 1980s, they began their zigzagging. They went to Kalmykia, which is a Buddhist republic on the Caspian Sea. Then they went back to Kyrgyzstan. Then they moved to Chechnya, and their timing was terrible. They got to Chechnya just before the war there started. They fled Chechnya with 4 small children back to Kyrgyzstan. Then they went to Dagestan, which sounds like Kyrgyzstan, but is 1,500 miles away, back in the North Caucasus. And again, their timing was awful. They got to Dagestan just as the war in Chechnya spread to Dagestan.
So they're kind of ultimate victims of what was happening as the Soviet Union collapsed.
Well, they're among many ultimate victims. But yes, their story is, it's incredible because their luck and their timing seems so bad. And their intentions actually seem so good. I mean, basically all they were trying to do for 2 decades was find a place where they could give their children an education and give them a future. So they finally land in Boston. They managed to land in Boston in early 2002, so just after 9/11.
You make a very interesting point about their arrival in America. You say that they did probably lie about their origins and what they'd been doing beforehand because actually all migrants in that situation almost have to.
There's a thing that you have to do when you arrive is you have to make your story intelligible to American asylum officials. And you have to have some understanding of what they're looking for, which is actually in flux all the time. And it was very much in flux in 2002 when they arrived, because Russia had gotten to reframe its war in Chechnya as a war against international and Muslim terrorism, which it had never been. It was a war against an insurgency. And they managed to reframe their story and to portray themselves as victims of the war in Chechnya, which technically they weren't. I would say on a larger spiritual level, they certainly were, like all Chechens.
And then, so they try very, very hard to live the American dream. They get some help in Boston and Cambridge from a Russian-speaking hippie landlady kind of thing. And they start out and they try all sorts of schemes to make money. And in the end, they kind of feel, or the impression from your book is they feel they have been sort of locked out of the American dream, economically knocked out, not politically.
Like a lot of immigrants, and like virtually every immigrant family that we have seen that has produced terrorists. It's a classic story. Terrorists usually come from a middle-class immigrant background, but that has become disenfranchised. And the Tsarnaev story is just absolutely tragic. It looked like things were going to work. The oldest brother had Olympic dreams, and they weren't crazy dreams. He was a very talented boxer. And at some point, the Amateur Association, which had been winning competitions, suddenly changed its rules to exclude non-citizens. And so he couldn't compete, he couldn't qualify for the Olympics that year. And the mother got a beautician certificate and got a good job, and then the financial crisis happened, and the beauty salon went belly up. And somehow, after about 8-9 years of living in the U.S., they found themselves in exactly the same disenfranchised, completely sort of static, stagnant position that they had been in all their lives.
Yeah. They were doing the same kind of jobs under the hoods of cars, and delivering pizzas, the same kind of marginal jobs. But the other very interesting thing about this story, and you make this point again and again, is that we are told that this is about radicalisation. There is a small group of people who radicalise other people and turn normal people into terrorists. And you try very, very hard to find out whether radicalisation took place for these brothers, and you conclude it didn't happen at all.
Well, actually, I conclude more. I think radicalization doesn't exist at all. Not in the sense that we have come to believe it exists, which is basically that the idea is that there's a large international organization that recruits young men and puts them through the paces that are identifiable: pre-radicalization, radicalization, and then terrorism. Well, obviously, in the Tsarnaev's case, that's not what happened at all, because they didn't even have an international organization that they belonged to. So the FBI has been using this funny term self-radicalization about the Tsarnaevs, as though they recruited themselves and put themselves through the paces. But actually what we know, and if you talk to terrorism scholars, this is no great discovery, they've known this for years, is that terrorists generally, radical behavior is not a good predictor of terrorism. A lot of people, most people who hold radical beliefs, don't actually engage in violent behavior, even people who think that violent behavior is justified. And what's even worse is that some terrorists don't hold radical beliefs or haven't held them for very long.
So if that's so, why did this young man and his older brother end up killing people in the Boston Marathon?
Well, this is tricky because the story that I'm telling, which is a story of disenfranchised immigrants, and again, if you talk to terrorism scholars, they will tell you terrorists are likely to come from immigrant communities, middle-class backgrounds, secular backgrounds. Usually they don't have a religious education. Usually one distinguishing characteristic is that they have a small social circle, and all their contacts and marriages are formed in that social circle. And often they come from an engineering background. Another distinguishing characteristic that is typical of many people is they have a high tolerance for risk, obviously. Well, I've just described millions of people, and most of them don't become terrorists.
But the Tsarnaevs looked at American policy, didn't like it, and decided to hit back. Simple as that.
And that's the most troubling thing, is that it's a rational decision. And one thing that terrorism scholars have been saying since the 1980s, since we first started talking about international terrorism, is that one distinguishing characteristic of terrorists is their normalcy. So basically, I think that maybe we're asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
We don't ask the question, what makes an unhappy person into a murderer, right? Because we realize some people just become murderers. There's an anomaly to violent crime. We don't talk about terrorism the same way. Somehow we think that there has to be a logical explanation that will allow us to solve this problem. Terrorism is like a lot of other crimes, and it should be treated as a crime and not as a war.
Steve Hilton.
I was just wondering, it's a fascinating story, and I was just wondering, do you think that there is an ideological component to it, just in this case? Or is it purely resentment and frustration boiling over into, expressing that in a violent way and thrill-seeking, whatever it may be? Or was there an ideological component at all?
Ideology, when we say the word ideology, we often mean that it's something big, comprehensive, and complex. Well, ideology, say when Hannah Arendt described ideology, she actually described it as a simple idea that is used to explain everything and is used to justify violence. And I think that's something that absolutely unites totalitarian regimes and terrorism.
Well, we come back very interestingly to one of the things in Steve's book about the liberating effect of new technologies and the internet and so forth, because it's perfectly clear that these brothers believed that the 9/11 bombing was a Zionist plot, had fallen into the whole series of conspiracy theories that you can find very, very easily on the internet. And isn't that a crucial part of the story as well?
Well, actually, it's fascinating that I interviewed people all over the world for this book, and they would produce the exact same conspiracy theory about the Boston Marathon bombing, word for word, in Chechnya, in Dagestan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Las Vegas. So in that sense, yes, the technology, the impact of the information flows around the world is absolutely mind-boggling. But I think that technology doesn't create connections that don't exist offline. It facilitates them and it speeds them up.
It makes them easier.
Yeah, it makes them easier. But the notion that there'd be these conspiracy theories, they could have spread maybe more slowly, even in the absence of technology. I mean,
Exactly.
I think the critical thing here is the lack of hope. That our system failed to give these young people any sense of hope. And I think the real lesson from the story that we just heard is that if you give, if there are enough people who have no hope, out of that large number of people who have no hope, there is always the risk of a very small percentage turning out to act in a deviant way. And the lesson out of that, I think, is to try to give more people hope.
But
Well, I think there's a connection between hope and belonging. And I think that the one thing that terrorism offers that American society hasn't offered these immigrants and a lot of other immigrants is a sense of belonging. You feel like a nobody. You feel like you don't matter. And suddenly you can belong to something great. And you can be somebody, and not just a somebody, but somebody who declares war and a great power, and it responds in kind.